Alafia, and welcome back to Black Love Free, a spiritual political podcast dedicated to Black spirituality, healing, and Black liberation. I am your host, Brendane, a reluctant anthropologist, hoodoo, student of the Ifa Orisha tradition, and an energy healer. First off, I want to say thank you all so much for the warmest welcome back. Your outpouring of love has been so beautiful and encouraging. And from the comments that we've received on Instagram and in other places, right, I can see that so many of us are approaching a new beginning in our lives. Thank you for allowing me to witness you as you witness me. Today, I'm coming to you live and direct after the solar eclipse in tropical Virgo. And if you're hearing these words in the earthly realm, congratulations. You have been left behind. The rapture did not take you up, honey. Jesus did not split the sky and come snatch you up. But in all seriousness, these past couple of weeks have been rough. I can see why the Christians would want an escape. And for those of us who are left behind, right, I'm curious. Have you been going through it these past couple of weeks? Have you been getting clarity about yourself and your life at the same damn time? Because for me, that's my experience. I am tired and I've just been feeling this creative energy. I've been feeling this energy to really look at my life and assess where I am, what I'm doing, and if I'm truly living by the values that I profess. And thought that as we explore new beginnings, right, as we explore initiations, it's important for us to think about grief. It's important for us to think about the grief that's inherent in these new beginnings and the grief that is present in a ruthless self devotion. And so today we'll dive into the depths of grief with Mami Wata, with Audre Lorde, and with other thinkers. We'll even talk about how to refuse our oppressors' grief, which there is a lot of that happening right now, right? And so, as we listen, I want you to reflect on whose grief you've been feeling and whether you have allowed yourself to feel your own. And without further ado, let's get into it. As usual, I want you to join me in a collective breath. So, as usual, I want you to join me in a collective breath. Today, we're talking about grief, and that shit's heavy. There are so many things that we may be experiencing grief about. I know there are so many things that I am. And we all carry our own understandings of grief to this conversation. So, with this breath, we will clear the air, make space for the grief that's ours, and also give ourselves the time, the space, the breath to discern what isn't. So if you'll join me, thank you. According to the Oxford Reference Dictionary, grief is deep sorrow, especially that is caused by someone's death. Informally, it can also mean trouble or annoyance, such as this person is giving me grief. Synonyms for grief include misery, sadness, anguish, pain, agony, suffering, torment, despair, lament. And grief is derived from the old French word, and I'm not going to pronounce this right because I don't like French, grever, which means to burden. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines grief as a cause of such suffering. And in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, grief is positioned in opposition to joy. In European culture, grief is associated with darkness, with negativity. Grief is discreetly divided into stages to move through and to move on from. If we think about the psychology of grief, I'm sure we've all heard of those 5 stages of grief that include denial, acceptance, etc., etc., etc. And so oftentimes when we think about grief, we're thinking about grief as tending to a loss. But what is oppressive, I was going to say interesting, but actually the word is oppressive, about capitalism is that it doesn't give us the time to tend to that deep sorrow. When we lose something or someone, it might be reluctant to immerse ourselves into the darkness of grief because we got bills to pay or, quote, better things, happier things to do. For our oppressors and the institutions that oppress us, right? Grief is an impediment to progress. To recognize loss and to give it the space that it needs in our lives, to grieve it properly, right? To bear that burden of sorrow properly and to do it in a way that recognizes it as natural, right? To normalize death with a lowercase d, which we've talked about here in the podcast before. But for those of you who are unfamiliar, right? Death, as we define it with the lowercase d, means the continuation of life and not a necessary byproduct of capitalist ascension, right? So death, as our ancestors understood it, as part of a cycle of movement, of spirit, of energy, and life, and not as the collateral or byproduct sense or that we see in capitalism. And so if we were to honor our ancestral understandings of death and loss, right, that would more clearly position white supremacist capitalist oppression and those who mobilize its means, right, which is, violence and domination, as our enemies. Capitalism has a value system that is centered around power, and particularly the hoarding of power. So loss would be something that would be seen as an affront to capitalism. To recognize loss as a part of what it means to live and to begin again would actually undermine capitalist value around the accumulation of things. And so if we are attending to our resistance, then we're asking ourselves, what does it mean to grieve or to allow the burden of loss to weigh upon our hearts? When that requires vulnerability, openness, care, and connection, things that capitalist, white supremacist oppression opposes. Recently on social media, you might have seen folks talk about grief as love that is extended beyond the loss of life. There have been lots of folks who are trying to reclaim grief from a white colonized understanding of it as something to avoid by any means necessary, rid your life of, right? We can think of the Black Mirror episodes where folks are buying AI versions of partners so that they don't have to experience the grief of losing their partner, as an example of that. We can approach grief in this way. We can think of grief as love extended beyond loss, of course. But what if we actually understood it as a burden, as a suffering that we choose, as an expression of our appreciation and our value of the life or the institution or the thing that was lost, the relationship that was lost, the former self that was lost? What if we embraced that suffering and that grief instead of turning away from it or wanting to be let go of it too easily? What if we allowed it to burden us? What if we embraced the grief of losing ourselves, our former selves, our loved ones, and our communities? What if we allowed that burden of grief to guide us in our resistant practices and our living? I honestly believe that so much of what constitutes as a multiracial solidarity practice requires folks to not recognize their grief around the loss of their lives, of their loved ones, and their communities. In order to pursue a certain kind of quote unquote liberation, you have to do the act of refusing to recognize what you've lost and allowing others to witness that. What would shift in our resistance if we allow ourselves to feel the burden of oppression, of genocide, of slow death by cancer, microplastics, and other diseases, or the loss generated by state-sanctioned violence, femicide, transphobic violence, ableism? How would that transform us in our struggle for freedom? If we let grief take up the place that it must take, How might we release the undue burdens that our oppressors would try to give us? How can we untangle our grief from our oppressors so that we will not resemble them? Because as we talked about last episode, right? That is what Asada Shakur says is the ultimate sin of oppression. In order for us to do this, right, it's important for us to expand our understanding of grief and its connection to death and loss. Last season, we talked about surrendering to death, to accepting death as part of the cycle of energy, spirit, and life on this earth. Our ancestors had different relationships to death and loss, where grief was not something to be spiritually bypassed, but embraced. We might be able to think and imagine, right, how the world would look if we took that approach to grief, not as something to discard, delay, or eliminate, but as a suffering that extends our love and care and curiosity for each other and the earth beyond what death denialism and grief denialism might afford us. Christianity as a belief system requires a denial of grief. And those who practiced it, myself included, we might have a particular understanding where grief is not a part of the logic of worship. You don't grieve the Savior because his death is the one that sets you free. The religion and cultural system of Christianity does not include grief among the fruits of the Spirit, right, which are goodness, joy, prosperity, abundance, etc. Grief is not a part of that. And so one might say that that kind of loss is not a part of the value system of Christianity. Grief is not allowed in heaven, only joy. And this type of spiritual bypassing serves a colonizer. If the death and destruction that he causes can fall under the cover of dominion and be acceptable in God's sight, why should he suffer? Why should he dare to take on the burdens of grief? And if the oppressed suffer due to his actions, why should he allow himself to be burdened with their sorrow? In this way, right, we might understand oppression differently. We have talked about this in our learning community space, but here I want to bring this definition of oppression and expand it to include grief. Oppression in its most basic form is a theft of time and the displacement of death and death-dealing violence through the tools of marginalization, which is often based on identity. Oppression robs us of our integrity, requiring a totalizing misalignment of beings from their destiny, their purpose, their emotions, and their needs. Oppression refuses a safe expansion and a self-determined growth. In addition to all of this, oppression is the inability to be with the burden of your own sorrow, because death is displaced and so is grief. Oppression requires you to take up the grief of your oppressor and often crowding out the ability to feel your own. But we'll dive deeper into this in the rest of the podcast. So we say all this to think about how we integrate this into a practice of ruthless self-devotion. This must mean that an integral part of that path to ruthless self-devotion is giving yourself the time and the space to be in integrity with yourself and your grief. Taking the time to dwell in the darkness of grief, because our oppressors know that darkness is precisely the place where we gather the strength to struggle and to survive, where we reclaim our power. So this part of our practice will allow us to return to our own ancestral and indigenous ways of knowing. The question is how, especially when we are inundated with the burdens that our oppressors, wish to give us. Let's see. The primary reason why I wanted to center this episode on grief, and by way of grief, darkness and death, is because of the ways that I've had to live with grief in the past few years. To put it bluntly, right? I am not the bitch that I used to be. And that is because I've been enduring hard times and choosing not to spiritually bypass them, even though that's a hard choice. I really wish I could put on the new age. Oh, if only I think positively, the shit would change. Like, I really wish I could. but I'm being asked to mature past that. The loss of my grandmother has caused me to feel a grief unlike any other. And her 71st birthday would have been September 14th. She was a Virgo queen. And as I reflected on losing her, I began to think about how so many aspects of my life would tell me that grieving her would be a waste of time. I still have to work to survive. Quote unquote, the world is ending. For those of us who didn't get caught up in the rapture, we here at the end of the world, right? There are genocides everywhere. What does my pain and my suffering, what place do I have to feel that? Who gives a fuck if the way that I thought that I would live my life and the people that I thought would be in it, it's not the same anymore. There's so many more important things to think about. Who am I to sit with my pain, my suffering, and my loss when there are so many worse things happening in the world? Who am I to burden myself with my own grief? Who am I to ask my community to share in that suffering and that loss with me, or at least to witness it with me? Wouldn't I be a better model if I took on the grief that hangs in the air after mass destruction and chaos? I think that is the question that so many of us are holding. Who are we to sit with our grief, to sit with the losses that we all experience? And I guess the question that I have is, what kind of liberation, what kind of freedom are we pursuing if we can't even be with ourselves in the midst of getting there? So I went to, as I am prone to do, right? I went to elders, I went to ancestors, I went to other spiritual texts, other Black feminist texts to think about this. Because if we think about what our ancestors and our elders have offered us in their writings, for those of them who were in tune with their own healing in their own selves, fighting oppression was never about denying themselves the space to feel both the joy and the suffering that white supremacist capitalists, this heteropatriarchy brings. So I spent a lot of time pulling together the resources for today, and I'll, as always, link them in the show notes. And in particular, today we're going to call upon the Audre Lorde, or Gamba Adisa, as she went by, and her work, the Cancer Journals, as well as Dr. Zinju Earthlyn Manuel, from her book, Opening to Darkness, 8 Gateways for Being with the Absence of Light in Unsettling Times. We've talked about Audre Lorde pretty much every episode, so she needs no introduction, right? But Osho Zinju Earthlyn Manuel, PhD, is a poet, author, ordained Zen priest, and medicine woman. She is the author of The Shamanic Bones of Zen, The Way of Tenderness, The Deepest Peace, and more. And Manuel is a native of California who now resides in New Mexico. As we dive into the rest of the episode today, I want us to imagine that we're moving through this vortex of time, right? If time is a lesbian who returns to us again and again, right? We're thinking about grief and the process of feeling our grief as moving through the vortex of time in connection with the work that we've been doing over the last year. We are delving deeper into our transformation, to the darkness of the feelings our oppression tells us we must shy away from. We are sitting with death, grief, and transformation in order to bring about the worlds that we wish to see. And as we've talked about, this internal process of allowing ourselves the space to and the sovereignty to be with ourselves, right? That is the only way that we'll be able to create the worlds that we wish to see. And so at times it might feel like we are submerged in the ocean, moving through heavy, dense water with no promise of light. But we are not alone in this journey. Our ancestors and spirit guides, they move with us, they join us. And so today we'll be journeying to the depths of these waters with the beloved spirit, deity, and guide, Mami Wata. In order to recognize our grief and to give it the space that it needs, we must understand and transform our relationship to death and loss. Audre Lorde does this beautifully in the Cancer Journals, where she talks about her battle with breast cancer, which resulted in her losing one of her breasts, and some of the wisdom and insight that we'll draw upon today. The Cancer Journals, published in 1980, gives us a glimpse into Lorde's healing journey and transformation. Enduring these cancer treatments and the homophobia and sexism that she experienced while healing from that, or recovering rather, in the hospital, initiated her into this dark period of her life. She talks about the pain, faith, labor, and loving of the emotions that she had to pull up in order to make meaning out of the loss that she experienced. And there, in that space, she had to come to a new understanding of her purpose and her pain. And she writes, quote, "I must let this pain flow through me and pass on. If I resist or try to stop it, it will detonate inside of me, shatter me, splatter my pieces against every wall and person that I touch. There is no room around me in which to be still, to examine and explore what pain is mine alone. No device to separate my struggle within from my fury at the outside world's viciousness, the stupid, brutal lack of consciousness or concern that passes for the way things are. The arrogant blindness of comfortable white women. What is this work all for? What does it matter whether I ever speak again or not? I try. The blood of Black women sloshes from coast to coast, and daily says race is of no concern to women. So that means we are either immortal or born to die, and no note taken, unwomen. And so this passage, there's a lot to think about with this, right? But one of the things that I want to call our attention to is that Lorde is thinking around those same questions of how to hold her own grief while dealing with the outside world's viciousness. And she said there is no device to separate her struggle within from her fury, that lack of consciousness or concern that passes for the status quo. She's building that ability to behold her pain, to recognize it, to let it flow through her, and then pass on. Even if she has questions around whether it matters if she were to speak again or not, she's determined to try. Even when white women like Daly say that race is of no concern to women, and puts Black women in a space where either they live forever, they're immortalized through the stereotypes, right, through racism in certain ways, or they're born to die with no note taken on women. So she's sketching out the world in which she experiences this pain. And it's a world where Black women's pain, their reality, their structural position, or what I've called in my work, their time, space, place, is unrecognized. So what does she do there in that space, right? She continues, "I want to write rage, but all that comes is sadness. We have been sad long enough to make this earth either weep or grow fertile. I am an anachronism, a sport, like the bee that was never meant to fly. Science said so. I am not supposed to exist. I carry death around in my body like a condemnation. But I do live. The bee flies. There must be some way to integrate death into living, neither ignoring it nor giving into it. Some days, if my bitterness were a whetstone, I could be sharp as grief." And so the remedy to these two, quote unquote, different or opposing forms of suffering, right? The grief, the sadness, the anger within, and the rage, anger, and grief of what happens outside of herself, right? The remedy is to integrate death into living, neither ignoring it nor giving into it. So recognizing it for where it is and where it stands in her life, not attempting to bypass it, but to allow herself to transform and to be as sharp as grief. If we take this wisdom and we think about what it means to integrate death into our living, to allow ourselves to be submerged in the darkness of our grief, we might call upon Mami Wata as the spirit guide who might come to meet us in the darkness. I know for me, she has shown up in divination after divination to tell me to have some dignity, but also to help me to be transformed through generosity. So Mami Wata is here and present with us now, beckoning us to be transformed, to allow her love and the love that we cultivate through dignity to heal us. But for those of you who don't know her, I'll introduce her briefly. Not an all-encompassing introduction, but one that I hope will allow you to trust in the good that she has for you in the darkness of grief. Lilith Dorsey, in the book Orishas, Goddesses, and Voodoo Queens, this one right here, describes Mami Wata as a, quote, mermaid, a mother, and a creator. She's one of the most ancient deities, and her worship dates back thousands of years. Images of her often have the body of a woman and the tail of a fish or reptile. What's important to understand about Mami Wata, like so many of our indigenous deities, is that she doesn't represent just one deity, but thousands. And Dorsey says, quote, Mami Wata is seen as all the water deities, all the divine waters coming together in harmony. Like the images that are chosen to represent her, she is simultaneously reptile and human, straddling the earth and water, bridging culture and nature. She is the sacred mistress of all waters, end quote. So others might associate her with Yemeya or the Loa La Serene, but it's very important in our own reverence practices that we be careful not to conflate them, right? Mami Wata is not Yemeya. She's not the Loa La Serene. These are different divine energies, right? So we must tend to them differently. Dorsey writes that the domain of Mami Wata is primarily the healing waters, and her power can be applied to physical, emotional, spiritual, and even financial healing for her children. She is the deity who met our enslaved ancestors in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean Sea, containing their anger and grief and trauma, and allowing us to feel their pain through our veneration practices. Mami Wata meets the troubled mother and child in their grief as the water that never takes a rest, but rather invites them into healing. And according to Manuel in Opening to Darkness, Mami Wata is known for pulling folks down into the deepest water. The desire for transformation and healing can lead us to peaceful water in the form of retreats or being with healers we hope who can help us. But then, right when we expect serenity, Mami Wata reaches up, grabs us, and takes us down to the bottom of the water to die or to learn how to survive, end quote. In this process, in this new beginning of my own, I have encountered Mami Wata again and again. And each time, as I move through the vortex, as I move through those swirling waters, she reminds me that my vulnerability is my power, that my nakedness and my willing to show myself is a source of strength. And there, as I let go of the former masks and the former selves that did what they needed to do to bring me here, but no longer serve me, I find that my grief and I are held tenderly. And there, I am made anew. Here in this new space, in this new place, we are taking our grief and we're allowing that death integrated into living. We're allowing that to give us a greater discernment in looking at the world's viciousness, as Audre Lorde would name it. All right, so boom, all the hoopla around that man and his death, right? That man, Charlie Kirk, and his death. proves this fact to be true. Black and white Christians do not worship different sky daddies. Right? Folks will say all the time, white God, white people worship a different God than Black people. And that's not the case, right? The differences in quote unquote worship that people are seeing between Black Christians and white Christians is that Black Christians bring a lot of African indigenous spiritual practices and integrated that into Christianity because their ancestors were forced to, right? But the primary reason why these practices look different is because they both worship the same God who is white supremacist. Black Christians have submitted themselves to a religion that requires self-loathing, right? The denial of the flesh, where you are born unholy, right? You're born in sin. This religion requires a denial of self. It requires a complete disregard for self-protection. You turn the other cheek. The Lord will fight your battles. Because of this promise of heaven, the reward, the ultimate reward for all your goodness and devotion and discipline to this white supremacist God is heaven. Heaven is the ultimate white supremacist capitalist reward. It is the place that is free from suffering that Sky Daddy allows on earth, right? And it's filled with the hoard of the riches of the world. And if we really sit there and think about it, it's like, I don't know if any of y'all had the experience of being in churches where, they said heaven was paved with the gold streets and everybody get their own mansion, right? And that is just something that's really alluring to poor Black people who are suffering on earth. If they can ignore or bypass the conditions in which they live and continue to deny themselves and commit themselves to a God that doesn't love them, but requires their worship, and then they might end up in a place that's better than the place that God has created here on earth. Heaven entails an eternity of spiritual bypassing, where we're singing and praising Sky Daddy, basking in the eternal light of unearned forgiveness, where you can't be touched by the suffering of those on earth and those in hell. You're superior to them. You're above them. You can choose not to take on their grief. And I've said this before, but I want us to think seriously about heaven. I've said this before in the piece on Substack called Beyonce is Not Your Savior, because Beyonce has also been thrown in this mellow here. Folks are trying to figure out how can they actually really hold Beyonce or not hold her accountable in this moment. And so in that piece, I talk about the excuse that a lot of Black liberals use when they try to justify their unwavering support of her, which is that she provides us joy in suffering. And I talk about how this belief in joy being in this binary relationship to suffering, and that we can then lean into our vices to allow us to experience that joy, is an outgrowth of Christian thinking around heaven and heaven's relationship to earth. And if you are an anarchist, and not a white one, but true anarchist, like through and through, then more than likely, you have a belief system that the means by which you achieve your liberation are the means should be aligned with what you want at the end, right? So what does that mean in plain language? So, and I am not practicing anything now that I wouldn't want to practice when I am liberated or when I am free. So all that to say, right, in my teaching on a spiritual political theory of oppression, I talk about how the tool of Christianity helps sustains European binary thinking through the separation of the self. So separating one's mind from their body and their spirit, which the Bible does by telling you to renew your mind with the word of God, right? By not tending to your flesh, not tending to your body, and that separation from your spirit, which you must give to God. And the separation of heaven from earth, Because of this binary way of thinking, we conceptualize ourselves and our lives through this all or nothing split that then is perpetuated by oppression. Christianity also helps institute disbelief in one's ability to determine oneself while instilling the need for an external savior. Christians constantly talk about putting their joy and their hope in heaven because earth is corrupted and destined for destruction. And by separating the capitalist, patriarchal, anti Black suffering on earth from the white supremacist, light, wealth hoarding pleasure of heaven, white people, enslaved Africans, and other colonized people were offered a comfort staked in a never achievable future. And so this belief permeates movement work through the unspoken understanding that joy and suffering are at odds with each other and they cannot coexist. And one must compromise their values to have joy because there is no joy in struggle. And I could see, right? Why the marginalized who suffer, why the colonized who suffer might find this pretty seductive. It is seductive to look at the hell our oppressors create with the stolen time, energy, and spirit of our ancestors and us currently. It might be like promising to think that if only we could abandon ourselves for that promised horde that's bathed in light and whiteness and everything good, but I refuse. But I am so grateful that I am not chained to white supremacist patriarchal ideology, the only ideology that dictates that I can harm others, that I can pillage, rape, steal, kill, and destroy, i.e., that I can resemble my oppressor and my enemy and still be good and forgiven. I am so grateful that my spiritual practice does not require me to kill myself and my desires daily, nor does it require me to reach for this impossible standard of purity, righteousness, and perfection, necessitating that I condemn others and myself. I am so incredibly grateful that I can refuse an ideology that says that my God can be jealous and possessive, but I must be an open, clean vessel and martyr. And if we think about this, particularly in reference to Charlie Kirk, that man, that Voldemort, we can really start to ask more questions of Christian ideology in particular. If the center of a religion, the basis of a religion, the entire reason why it supposedly exists, right, is to celebrate the state-sanctioned murder of a martyr whose blood then lines your path to heaven, then why is it thoughts and prayers for a martyred believer? If that's a part of the religion, get online and say, pray for somebody who's supposedly going to heaven. Haven't they already been saved? Like, what are we praying for? Folks might make some weird logic around the tragedy, quote unquote, of his death. But if he's a follower of Christ, then why is Jesus the only one that gets to die a tragic death for his beliefs? What does it mean to be a follower if the expectation is for the Savior to be a scapegoat? That sounds like white supremacy to me. Zooming out of Voldemort, why are slavery, racism, an earth-destroying economic system, transphobia, queerphobia, ableism, and other forms of oppression forgivable or worse, embraced in this religion, right? Why is an institution rife with the violation of the poor, the sick, the young, and the elderly still considered sacred? Is it because the world that is structured by that institution upholds and undergirds, that world is so awful that we must dash our hopes elsewhere? Like, why would anybody want to worship a God that enslaves them and their ancestors and calls that enslavement pleasing and acceptable in his sight? I don't understand it. And I know, right, that there can be this false sense of freedom because you can cast your burdens unto the Lord. Folks be talking about how they feel free under Christianity because Sky Daddy's forgiveness is actually an escape from accountability. Their salvation is scapegoating. Their goodness is superiority fashioned through violence and domination, aka oppression. Their joy and grace are detachment from the material conditions of their reality and the suffering that they cause others. So, in my opinion, right, folks don't be free. They be spiritually bypassing, and they search for any antidote to their pain and the suffering of others that does not require them to take responsibility or accountability, but rather ask them to take dominion over others and the earth, but never they themselves. All of these contradictions highlight this truth, right? Christianity is the perfect spiritual political system for an oppressor. If hell is real, which I want to be clear, I do not believe that hell is real, but if it is, then I accept my fate. And I know that there's so many Black people practice Christianity in particular because they're afraid of hell. But if hell is real, honey, that's where I'm gonna be. And my plan is to be in VIP with my friends. In VIP, like where the gay section of hell, like that's where I'm about to be at. Um, because if hell is real, right, then all my homies about to be in there with me. And I don't want to be separated from them in heaven. I want to bear the burden of our suffering with those who loved me and who loved my living, not living forever with those who hated me. Like, let's be real, right? If racism is Sky Daddy's will and or a forgivable offense or sin, which again, these are contradictory statements. How can someone be racist and be of God, but then also, anyway, I'm not even gonna go down the he was racist, but he was one of us foolery, right? Like these things do not make sense. This is logic that does not make sense. But if racism is Sky Daddy's will, right, and or it's a forgivable offense, by which means that racists can be loved by God and embraced in heaven, then will heaven be segregated? Or does racism magically melt away there? Will heaven resemble Jim Crow? Will there be colored fountains in heaven? If this is God's will, like, will it resemble cities like Baltimore, DC, Charlotte, Tulsa, LA, but be more sparkly, be more gold paved? And if so, then why are niggas working so hard to get there? These are questions that I have. Furthermore, Sky Daddy is the only all powerful God that I know who isn't responsible for his believers' actions and words. Every time a believer or child of Sky Daddy does something morally reprehensible, it is the fault of the devil, an entity that he created and condemned, or the person themselves through free will. But if we continue to unpack this, right, we can think of white supremacy and Christianity as this universalizing, totalizing force, one that declares that we must all be the same, right? In order to be accepted into heaven, there's only one way to get there. Ooh, my stomach growling. And this universalizing, totalizing force, all of the room possible for white grief, for white death, but none for ours. White grief and white death is an abomination to Christian God, but Black death is a fact of life. We can think about this in the response to any lynching. We can think about this and contrast it to the response to Charlie Kirk, on time, ordained, and blessed death. In that space, the oppressed are called to ignore their own grief, their own burdens, to tend to the grief of their oppressors. And so there's a re-marginalization, right, that occurs within to match the viciousness of the world outside of us. And Lord talks about this. And she says, quote, "There is so much false spirituality around us these days, calling itself goddess worship or, quote, the way. It is false because it is too cheaply bought and little understood, but most of all, because it does not lend, but rather saps the energy we need to do our work. So when an example of the real power of healing love comes along, such as this one," and she's referring to the love that she experienced in her recovery process. It is difficult to use the same words to talk about it because so many of our best and most erotic words have been so cheapened. Perhaps I can say this all more simply. I say the love of women healed me. And so we're sitting here having these back and forths about grief with our oppressors, some of whom may look like us. But all that is sapping our energy from being able to tend to the real love and the real grief that we experience. And as Lord even says, I wish I had another word because it hurts to even call what we experience as grief in the same way because of the way that it's denied. I believe that it is a dishonor to my ancestors to believe that my grief and theirs resembles my oppressors. It could even be called the same thing. For my oppressors want to escape death. They want to escape darkness. They want to escape these natural things because they see them as the end of a capitalist form of ascension. And my oppressors find ways to do it through poisoning or killing what is life-giving, like water, air. And then they turn around and offer these false substitutes. An AI generated image of a talking baby, the vitamins that allow you to extend your life longer and to resist death a little bit more. Right? And with their tools, I can refuse the burden of the sorrow of African and Black peoples around the globe while remaining transfixed and fixated on the suffering and the sorrow of them. With their tools and with that denial, with their grief, I can be a master too. I can choose to pretend that what I do has no impact on earth. I can choose to see the destruction and the domination of the earth as God ordained. My oppressor's grief has three primary tools for expression, and it's denial, destruction, and death with a capital D. My oppressor's grief expresses itself through false tears and pointed fingers. This grief is an all-consuming light that aims to wash the color, feeling, care, and sight out of you by insisting that this is the way, the truth, and the life. And when we refuse the darkness and blackness of our grief in an attempt to gain the recognition of our oppressor, we forfeit our sovereignty and take on their burdens. In other words, when your oppressors mourn the very conditions that bound your ancestors, when their grief can only be the shape of destruction and chaos. It cannot the same as mine. So I'm not a historian, right? But I do, the autist in me is like, let's recognize a pattern, right? And so I want us to think about this pattern of what happens with white supremacist patriarchal grief and the way that it necessitates destruction around the world. One of the things that I've been saying for years, if you follow me on Twitter, you've seen it, right, is that what is happening now in quote unquote post-COVID era mirrors what was happening with the Spanish flu in the 20th century. And so for those of you who don't know, right, the Spanish flu happened around 1911 into the 1920s. And the Spanish flu eliminated, as they estimate, anywhere between 4 to 11% of the world's population. And of course, it was called the Spanish flu because the flavor of white xenophobia, European xenophobia at the time, was anti-Spaniard. The white ethnic groups were beefing. Were beefing among each other. The Anglo-Saxons and the others were beefing. And so they named it the Spanish flu in an attempt to demonize the Spanish. They wanted to assert a kind of superiority over the Spaniards in the same way that, COVID was born from China. Instead of tending to the mass loss that occurred, what happened in the 1920s and the 1930s and onward was a turn to genocide and a turn to death. We see the rise of anti-Black violence and genocidal violence around the world, right? We can look at the rise of the Nazis in Germany as a white grief response. We can look at the Red Summers and the killings of Black folks in the US as a grief response, that white supremacist grief response, where we see that white grief spurns mass death. Patriarchal grief spurns mass killing. We can see this mirrored now in all of the anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-Palestinian, and other forms of violence that is happening. Now, I'm not saying that this is purely the fault of COVID, right? But I'm saying that when these losses on a societal and world level happen, grief in the hands and the minds and the mouths of our oppressors takes a different shape. And so we have that same cycle of denialism, the same cycle of a white grief that spurns mass death, of a patriarchal grief that spurns mass killing. And in the wake of the grief of our oppressors, right, the world burns and we along with it. And so when we try to compare and use that language, that we try to compare our experiences of grief to our oppressors using their language and their understanding of it, right? That might in part explain the fear that white people might have around Black uprising, right? Well, if we truly tapped into our grief and felt our grief, wouldn't we want to destroy them? That common belief there. It is this destruction that, for me and my understanding, creates the mandate for us to untangle our grief from our oppressors, to refuse their mourning and the violence that is spurned by their mourning, to have access to our attention, our energy, and our spirits. White supremacist grief necessitates destruction. It demands the lives alongside the land, and that they both pay for the loss. Bones and earth are turned to dust. This white grief insists on the loss being so total and so brutal that only scorched earth can exist in its place. There is no healing, only consumption. There is no repair, only raising. And their grief spurns rubble and fires and broken limbs and broken oceans and corrupted cycles and bodies and bodies and bodies. And it would seem that the promise of heaven, it is simply a sedative to allow us to pretend that hell is not already here. Allow us to pretend that anything other than our refusal to resemble our oppressors will save us from their unnatural death. Audre Lorde tells us, quote, "After all, what could we possibly be afraid of after having admitted to ourselves that we have dealt face to face with death and not embraced it? For once we accept the actual existence of our dying, who can ever have power over us again?" And the whole premises of Christianity is to escape the wages of sin, right? To escape death and to have everlasting life. And so by running towards this everlasting life, running away from ourselves and our ancestral and indigenous ways of knowing, we turn away from the darkness and the blackness of grief towards the light. I don't wish to do that, though. I don't wish to spiritually bypass, because I see grief as necessary. I see the darkness of grief as necessary for transformation, but it's difficult. For me, the hardest thing about grief is the mirror that it provides for truth. In the aftermath of my grandmother's death, I struggled with the complex memory that I have of her. She's not a saint. She's not a she's not a martyr. My grandmother was a very complicated woman, and I wrote about this complex memory that I have of her years ago. I Then in 2023, thought that she would not be truly mourned by many, that others, including myself, would have to deal with our own ambivalent feelings towards her. And after her death, I experienced significant anxiety thinking about what her memorial services would be like. I was afraid that people would get up there and try to remake my grandmother into a saint. And, more or less that is what happened. I didn't think that it was possible that folks would attempt to wipe the slate clean or try to remake her as a saint and angel. The night that my grandmother took her final breaths, my family gathered around and sang. And those who were in the room with her, because I, at that point, had already gone back to Maryland after visiting her. So I was not able to be there physically. Those who were there with her, they held hands, they sang. We reminded her that she was loved. So I was there on the phone as well. And her sister, my aunt, the one who still faithfully goes to Adventist church, she prayed for God to receive her. She said, God, I know you remember Brenda. She is saved. She's baptized. She loved you. And I knew my aunt was earnestly praying out of her own belief, out of her own need to be comforted that her sister would go to heaven. And I was touched. I was moved by that. But also in that moment, I realized I am so grateful that I don't believe in heaven. I'm grateful to know that my grandmother won't go there or won't be refused entry there. Heaven is no good place for Black women, particularly if those who create the conditions in which being a Black woman is oppressive will be there. When she gets to heaven, right, what would she do? Is she going to sit at the right hand of Ronald Reagan? Is she going to dap up Charlie Kirk? Is she going to dap up Charlie Kirk with MLK and Malcolm X? Get the fuck out of here. Absolutely not. In the middle of the breakup conversation with my former lover a few weeks ago, while we are discussing the end of our relationship, my mother called me to let me know that my childhood pastor had died. This was yet another loss that I experienced over the last couple of years, but this one didn't hurt in the same way. I think I'd already grieved that relationship years ago. When I came to visit the church of my childhood to see my sister, and I wasn't there to worship, I was just there to see my sister. And she told me, that I had this dark cloud hanging over me. I had just lost my father. So that dark cloud, that darkness that she sensed was my grief. But the remedy that she offered was for me to turn back to the God I knew, the God of my childhood, the God whose heart I had, but who condemned me as Jezebel, as witch, as girl, woman possessed with demons, with a smile that turned people, especially men and boys, away from him. The same God who told a 25-year-old man that 15-year-old me was his wife. The same God that gave prophets and prophetesses and other members of the church visions of teenage me fucking people at football games that I had never been to. The same God that she, the pastor, thanked for slavery because without slavery, we wouldn't know Jesus. The same God that said slavery, racism, homophobia, and cis heteropatriarchy are pleasing and acceptable in his sight. The same God that couldn't change his mind about sin that he created. So he had to impregnate a teenage girl and sentence their son to death to bear the burden of the world's grief and pay for our sins. She wanted me to return to the girl who was scared to be too bold, who was shamed into not smiling or feeling anything other than joy, or who was shamed into not wearing clothes that actually fit me. And I knew that would be the last time that I walked into that church, because I could not return to that God. I could not choose oppression now that I had known freedom, now that I had known the blessed weight of my own grief. And even now, I refuse to. You see, my grief is black. It is dark. It's filled with depth, but not all consuming. My grief does not aim to rule the world and to limit who's in and of it. Instead, my grief that does not resemble my enemies expands my world. It makes room for every and anybody that I love. My grief moans at the suffering of children, of women, of trans people. It compels me to action beyond awareness, to recognize when, where, and how oppression and loss happen. It presses me to seek remedy and repair. When I sit with the darkness of my grief, I can embrace death as becoming. The unwillingness to submit to the darkness of grief is what brought us here, right, to this moment. What does it mean that the systems of oppression that shape the world that is deny, suppress, and limit grief? Or they only permit a kind of enmeshment with the grief of one's oppressor. The truth is that they got us fucked up. They got us thinking that our and our enemy's destruction is mutual. But if that were true, if that were the case, then that would not make my enemy. The destruction of my enemy, right? The end of my enemy is liberation. And anything other than that is the antithesis of it. My oppressor's grief is not true, right? It becomes the excuse to wreak havoc, to destroy, to cause more harm. This destruction serves the purpose of affirming that suffering and death is not their portion, but the portion of those that they oppress. The oppressor's grief is not love made infinite beyond death, but rather it's a reaffirmation of their supremacy or superiority and entitlement to others' bodies, lives, breath, and space. It is the expansion of conquest, the grudge that undertakes genocide and justifies it, the outrage at the reminder that despite all of the work that they've done to escape death, right, through the theft of time, the theft of bodies, the enslavement and exploitation of others' labor, that death is still their fate. For the oppressor, grief is the substrate for revenge, not self-transformation. The reason for vengeance for the wrong that loss is a part of living. The evidence that the hoarding and accumulation inherent in capitalism, in fact, does not shield one from the pain, does not lead to an ever-present light in darkness. Grief is the externalized anger at the fact that the attempts to make the world in their image and likeness still doesn't allow them to control death. That the attempt to refashion the cycle vortex of life and time into a line, right, through the chaos of violent, destructive domination does not lend them true control or totalizing power, but instead a life, capital L life, that is constantly fueled by the promise of escape and salvation. This grief is the self-consuming desire to be rescued from the world created by their actions, their deeds, their thoughts, their feelings, and their beliefs. It is the inability to look into the dark mirror and change, to build and to sustain a world where progress is not synonymous with abandonment. You cannot control something into oblivion, obliterate it, and ask it to serve you. There has to be some piece of the oppressed that the oppressor keeps alive. And that is that piece that sustains the cycle of oppression, of abuse, of domination. If the oppressor can convince the oppressed that that piece of themselves belongs to them, then they've got them. And that is what it means to be saved. After you deny your mind, you deny your body, you leave your soul and your spirit to be held in the oppressor and in their God's hands. That piece of you, that core of you, then belongs to and is protected by and is needed by that same God that made you unworthy. The grief I hold for my grandmother, for my former selves who endured pain, loss, and poverty, and the grief that my oppressor demonstrates are not the same. One is feeling an extension of love and curiosity and care beyond life. The other, enmeshment, life ending, an unrighteous entanglement of my soul with what can only be seen as the light work of anti-Black oppression. The violence of capitalism and colonialism is that we are not allowed, permitted, and expected to grieve ourselves. We are not allowed to tend to our wounds in the presence of those who inflict them. I am supposed to see my wounds as necessary, or worse, ignore them in the way my blood soaks into the cracked earth. And so I take up healing so that I don't resemble my oppressor, that I may face the darkness of grief, the necessity to embrace death and life again. My healing embrace truth with self-compassion and self-devotion. I turn away from that spiritual bypassing mess and realize that I want to feel good while I bear my suffering and sorrow, but not the spiritual bypass, white supremacist, capitalist, Christian good, where I deny the things that are happening around me, the reality of the world. But I mean, like, fuck, like, the world is ending good. Like, I've danced all I can dance, shaken my ass all I can shake, cried all the tears that I could cry, and poured all the libations I can pour, that I have met myself in the darkness and held her. And in that space, gave myself grace. What level of enmeshment, what level of self-betrayal and self-abandonment must we engage in to give those that oppress us the grace that we should give ourselves? I wonder, is the self-loathing spurned by oppression so great that my people would not be able to separate truth from projection? That the best they could hope for is martyr footstool here on earth and in heaven? If the world stopped every time one of us died, time would have to run counterclockwise. We would have to be caught up in the vortex of the grief of our ancestors, the grief of our past selves, our past lives, the grief of our people. If we allowed time to stop and make space and room for our grief, we wouldn't have any space to be consumed by the concerns of our oppressors. This is not easy to say, right? So much of what has been indoctrinated in us as a society is to run away from darkness, to run away from Blackness, refuse our ancestral understandings of death and grief, and instead run towards the light, run towards salvation, to embrace a colonial fear of death and grief. But I propose that the only way for us to get ourselves out of this mess right here and right now, or for us to transform and continue to move through our practices of ruthless self-devotion, we would need to refuse the light. We have to contend with our own preconceived notions about darkness and prods us. What of darkness terrorizes us so that we run from it rather than go deeper into it? How can we bear dark times, or more explicitly, horrifying times, with the skill of an awakened one? Misery, struggle, and sorrow are not the sole intentions of this life. Yet we can respect our interrelationship with everything in the world, including the suffering in, around, and between us. Is there a way to live in unsettling times that we have forgotten? Our fear of darkness and our aversion to suffering is deeply connected to anti-Blackness. Manuel calls this light supremacy. And she says, quote, "It is this supremacy that makes it important to explore beneath the words and experiences attached to the words in order to transform and heal the fear and anxiety around darkness and Blackness and its being rendered inferior to lightness and whiteness. And to explore our dark experiences so that when faced with them, we are not looking for light, but rather being with darkness provided as ground for transformation and renewal. Our disconnection from essential darkness and Blackness has created pervasive terror and anxiety when we are up against what and who is considered dark or Black. In essence, the sight of darkness and Blackness, or the feel of darkness, can trigger a response to eliminate, to kill in various ways, or to annihilate darkness and Blackness without seeing that there is no reason to do so. When we seek to eliminate darkness, we remove the place, the womb in which we awaken. To reclaim the purity of darkness and blackness is to recall its role in shaking us loose of what we think we are or what we think is happening in life. And so Christianity offers a kind of false remedy to darkness, pathologizes it, marks it as wrong, and says that darkness is a thing to condemn, and heaven is a place of light. I don't know if any of y'all were taught this, but we were taught in church that heaven is light all day and all night. There's no darkness in heaven. There's no night in heaven. And you spend 25/8 praising God and basking in his light. And so there's that fear of darkness. There's that fear of blackness. And they work together, right, to undergird this oppressive force. So if we are to liberate ourselves from that, right, we have to start thinking differently about darkness and blackness. Immanuel says this: there's nothing that can take darkness away, fix our trauma, or dispense with our suffering. Our primal nature cries out to be lifted out of darkness, as a mother might lift her frightened baby. If there were something, some religion, some healing modality that could remove all suffering, it would be sold in a purple pill at the price of a house. So what is this insurmountable chaos and suffering that we experience today? What do we do with darkness, with dark times? Learn to see through them, use them to understand life. Learn how to live fully despite darkness. Collectively, I sense that we are being asked to stand up when the chaos is so thick that we have no idea what to do with it. We're being asked to see collectively in the dark and see what it is trying to tell us. It is time to grow out of primal screaming as habit and use it only when necessary. Perhaps in the moment, you and I, or at least those parts of us that think we know everything, are being killed by the divine. What's important to take from this passage in particular is she understands this aversion to darkness to be connected to a primal fear of not knowing, of not being able to see and move forward. I disagree with that. I don't think that it's necessarily primal fear to be afraid of the dark, but I do think that whiteness and white supremacy teaches that fear and teaches the remedy or relief in that fear is to cry out. And we can see that, right? With all the ways that people be crying out on social media about all the different things, and that crying out is them looking for someone to save them, someone to relieve them of the burden of their pain or that grief. It's important for us to think about what we talked about last episode, which is what are the ways that we can resist this white supremacist notion of a savior? How can we sever the savior, as Jada K. Story says, in order to be able to hold the burden of our grief in our own hands, in our own communities? When we allow the burden of our grief and suffering to be held in our own hands, not to be pushed away or marginalized by oppression, we can move to a kind of transformation that is only possible through darkness. Manuel says, and I quote, "Transforming through suffering plunges you deeper into darkness so that you can open to it. In the dark experience of shock, the mystery of transformation was unlocked. Without the descent, the darkness, I would not have discovered that there is a way to stay alive through horrific experiences in which you know you are dying, literally or metaphorically. There's a way to stay alive in the suffering life brings. We can use the suffering to access awareness. Since we feel the shedding away, dark experiences can make it seem as though we are losing something when it may be that we are transforming. We are going beneath the surface of life, diving deep while increasing our inner vision. We often miss recognizing transformation in the dark as a spiritual experience when we attend to our fears. An understanding of the darkness as transformative might help reduce, if not eliminate, those fears. So Manuel prods by asking, haven't you lived through your dark experiences? What changed in you? Take your time to reflect on the times that you survived. Where were you mentally, physically, and spiritually? I think it's important for us to take some time to consider that for ourselves. When we give ourselves the space and time to grieve rather than begging and asking our oppressors for that space and time that they can't give us, because then we would want to rebel against their systems. Allow yourself to grieve those versions of you. Allow yourselves to grieve here in this dark place. What versions of you did you lose in the darkness? What are the words that you might have left unsaid? What are the ways that you've had to rediscover and redefine your strength and your purpose? For there was no light to reveal it to others, only darkness for you to revel in it yourself. May you tend to the selves, the lovers, the institutions, and the others that you need to grieve. Here, won't you tend to your own suffering? Won't you release the burdens of your oppression so that the burden of your own living can sit squarely on your back in your and your ancestors' hands? What parts of yourself are you abandoning to take up the grief, rage, emotions, sadness, right? Or other emotions of your oppressors? Worse yet, what parts of yourself are you abandoning in an attempt to change your oppressor? And as we've talked about in the past, in order for us to practice ruthless self-devotion, we need to release the need to see the evidence of our goodness in others' change behavior. When we abandon our grief to take up our oppressor's grief, or to even try to change them or hope that we can show them in some way to recognize our own, we forfeit our own sovereignty. We are moving away from the darkness in its transformative power. We are refusing the power of our ancestors for the light of our oppressor. But this is why you will never hear me call myself a light worker. I'm not a light worker, baby. I leave that to them. I, through my own experiences, deeply understand the power of darkness, and that to embrace darkness is to embrace myself. I understand now that the deaths that are born through the initiation, through the experiences that I've had, bring me to a ruthless self-devotion that can only bring about greater growth and greater harmony with nature and with others. In this space, I have learned that freedom is not the absence of burdens, because that is, in this space, I have learned that freedom is not the absence of burden, because that requires a savior, a scapegoat, and really doesn't allow me to live a life for real, right? But rather, freedom is the ability to carry one's burden, my burdens, and to share them with community, not through power and domination, but through connection and consent. When we are frantic and frenetic about what our oppressor might do to us in response to us not bearing the burden of their grief, we abandon ourselves and we abandon any possibility of self-protection. We instead run to the same ones who hurt us and harm us, who would hang us from trees, and ask them to save us here and now. For what? For the promise of heaven? For the promise of continued subjugation even after death? Make it make sense. So I ask you, dear listener, will you join me in bearing the burdens of our grief? Will you join me in refusing the grief of our oppressors? If so, join me in affirming, alongside our ancestor Audre Lorde, I am who the world and I have never seen before. Tending to my grief allows me to grow, allows me to validate my own suffering, and to refuse to carry the suffering of my oppressor. That's all I got for y'all today. Thank you for taking the time to listen. I hope this episode gives you permission to tend to your grief as part of the foundation to being ruthlessly devoted to yourself. I want to express my deepest gratitude to my elevated ancestors and spirit guides, to the Most High God for giving me the inspiration and the fortitude to do this work. I do not take it lightly. I also want to thank Jemiah Jacob, Black Love Free's community coordinator, for her work. And if you want to keep up with future episodes, follow us on Instagram at black.loved.free. Subscribe to our Substack and YouTube page while you're at it. Be sure to give us 5 stars and a review wherever you listen to podcasts. That helps us reach other listeners. And if you're listening on Spotify, leave us a comment to let us know what you think of the episode. If you'd like to give us feedback, send an email to black.loved.free@gmail.com. And if this episode touched you or made you think differently about grief and oppression, share it with someone that you think would benefit from that. If you really want to bless us, if you really want to keep the lights on, please donate to the podcast by visiting the link on our website. And lastly, may you find a sacred, soft place to care for yourselves and for each other. May you radiate in the truth that you are the one who saves you. And may you find the strength to be Black, loved, and free. Until next time, bye.